Hello all, Kenny C here after a 3-year hiatus. A lot has happened since my last upload and I've been busy, but I'm back with a video that I've been sitting on for about 4 years now, and that is my month in New Zealand. Now this was back in February, March 2020, just before the world went into lockdown due to the pandemic. And in fact, I was actually in New Zealand when every country started closing its borders, which made for a very stressful 72 hours trying to flee back to the UK. But you'll be glad to hear that I won't be going over that in this video. What I will be covering are my 8 favourite places that I visited during my time there, along with some broader commentary about my trip. Now before I dive into the list, it's worth noting that I took different approaches to both islands. How I got about the North Island was thanks to the Stray Coach network, and so was travelling with a large group of other backpackers the entire time. I then split off from this when I flew to Christchurch and began my South Island experience, which I solo travelled in a juicy van. I'll share my thoughts on both at the end of the video, as well as a breakdown in costs in case that's something that you're after, but for now, let's crack on with the list. First up, we have a small coastal town called Hahei. Now I've actually already done a video on this place, so I'll be quick and link to this other video somewhere on screen or in the video description if you do want a more in-depth overview of this place. It's located in a region called the Coromandel, which is a stretch of land on the east coast north of Auckland. Hahei is a super chilled out place and is perhaps best known for being home to one of New Zealand's postcard shots, Cathedral Cove. It's just under an hour walk from Hahei Beach to the cove, although there is another form of transport which I would highly recommend, and that is via kayak. Now I took part in a sunrise kayak experience, which was easy to organise thanks to the Stray app, and is one of the benefits of travelling with a company like Stray, as they'll often have discounted rates on local experiences, and it just saves you a lot of time searching online what activities are in which location. One benefit I found with the sunrise kayak is that we got to experience Cathedral Cove without the swarms of people, so it was a sharp contrast to the sights I'd seen less than 24 hours before when we'd made it there on foot. Next up on the list is Hobbiton. Now obviously your enjoyment of Hobbiton is likely to be heavily influenced by how big a Lord of the Rings fan you are. If like me, they are the best films to have ever graced cinema, then I imagine you won't need that much persuading. What may in fact be useful, however, is for me to talk about the type of package I bought when visiting. Now I'd say 90% of the people that visit book the standard day tour, and this was the only option that the Stray app presented you with at the time when I was out there. I wanted as much time there as possible, so I did some extra research ahead of time and opted instead for the evening banquet tour. How this differs is in the following ways. 1. You get more than double the amount of time in Hobbiton. 2. Your group is the only group there at that time, which means that in some instances it feels like you have the entire place to yourself. 3. Once you make it to the Green Dragon Inn, you get your complimentary drink and then are served a massive 3-course banquet dinner, which was incredible. And then lastly, once you've finished dinner, you're taken back the way you came, but by this point it should be dark, so you get to see Hobbiton and all the little hobbit holes lit up, which adds to how magical this place already feels. Although the banquet tour costs 200 New Zealand dollars, it is worth every penny. And seeing as this was somewhat of a pilgrimage for me, I am so happy to say that it lived up to my very, very lofty expectations in every way possible. Next up is Blue Duck Station, which is probably the least well-known destination in this video. It's very off the beaten track, and there's no way I would have found myself here if it wasn't one of the stops on the Stray bus network. Blue Duck Station is a wilderness and conservation retreat located pretty deep in the New Zealand bush. There are a number of activities that you can take part in, like horse riding, clay pigeon shooting, an SUV safari-like experience, and I believe you can stay in far fancier accommodation than what we had through Stray, so I'll include a link to their website in the description if you want to look more into this. I was on a budget, so opted for the free activities whilst here, which, as you can see, was a hike to a nearby waterfall that took about an hour and a half to get to. I then found some kayaks hidden away and decided to take one of them for a spin. The fact that there were no accompanying paddles did make me think that these probably weren't to be used, but I have to say, using a big stick as a paddle is a mightily impressive improvisation move on my part. If you stop here with Stray, then from memory, it tends to be one of the designated party nights. So We had a big night the day that we arrived, which was a lot of fun, and so my hike the next day may have also been to help nurse a slight hangover. Lastly, one of the best reasons to do this with Stray is because it leads directly into recommendation number 4, which was probably my favourite day of the entire month, and that is the Tongariro Crossing. Now, this is regarded by many as the best one-day hike in New Zealand, and personally is one of the best one-day hikes I've ever done anywhere in the world. Once again, the beauty of doing this with Stray is that all of the logistics are sorted for you. They used a tour operator called Adrift Tongariro, who arranged the drop-off and pick-up either side of the crossing, as that's one thing to bear in mind. This is not a loop hike, so you will need to have some form of transportation arranged once you get to the end. The hike itself takes around 6 to 8 hours and covers 12 miles or 19 kilometers for any of you non-Brits. I don't think I've ever enjoyed a hike as much, even when I compare it to those that I've done in the Swiss Alps or the Italian Dolomites. I think what makes this hike so special is how much the scenery over the duration of the hike changes. This should be easier to see in the footage rather than me trying to explain it, but the crossing will have you walking up steep volcanic slopes, across huge flat sections that make it feel like you're on the surface of Mars. You'll walk by the very appropriately named Emerald Lakes, and finally through the dense New Zealand bush. And with this being New Zealand, of course, this famous landmark was used in the filming of The Lord of the Rings, with Mount Tongariro posing as Mount Doom. What this means is that if you listen to the Lord of the Rings soundtrack whilst you're ascending, then it makes the whole experience 10 times more epic. Now, heading over to the South Island, one of my first stops was in a small coastal town called Kaikōura. I was only here for an afternoon, so with that said, I don't know a great deal about this place, but it seemed like a really chilled out and picturesque town. The main attraction to my knowledge is the marine life that's on offer, so I didn't hop on a boat and go whale watching, but what I did do was walk along the coast and admire the huge sea lion colony that seemed to be frequent residents of this particular part of the coast, and made for some excellent models. Besides this, I don't have too much else to say on this one, as I was only there for an afternoon and went just to see the sea lions following a recommendation from someone I'd met on the Stray bus a couple of days prior. So if, like me, you like wildlife, then Kaikōura might be worth a visit. Next up is Mount Cook National Park. Now, the drive alone makes this place worth a visit, as driving along the banks of Lake Pukaki with Mount Cook looming large directly in front of you is an epic sight to behold. Once you get to Mount Cook Village, you'll have your pick of which hikes and trails you want to do, and obviously I'm not an expert because I only did one, but from what I've seen, the most common hike is the Hooker Valley Track, which is relatively flat, making it accessible for most people. Now, if you're up for something more challenging and want to spend the night 1,000 meters up in the mountains, then I would recommend the Muller Hut Track. This is definitely one of the more challenging hikes I've done, as it consists of a pretty brutal 2,000 plus step staircase, which is a calf burner for sure.
Oh my god.
But once you do get to the top, the views are spectacular. Some people do this hike there and back in a day, which I think would be very tough on the knees. So what I'd recommend doing is booking yourself a space for the night in the Muller Hut, which gives you a chance to rest before the descent the following day. Again, I'll include a link to where you go to book this in the description below if this is something that you're interested in. Staying the night will also allow you to fully soak in the epicness of this place. I got an incredible sense of isolation up there, and it's often one of my New Zealand memories that I most fondly look back on. It was eerily quiet, with the silence occasionally being broken by these deep thunderous sounds of cracking ice and falling snow from Mount Sefton nearby. There's also very little phone service up there, so it acts as a nice digital detox. As you can see, I got set up in a good spot to watch Mount Cook slowly change colour as the day came to a close, making for one very memorable sunset. Given it's not every day that you spend the night on top of a mountain, I'd also recommend setting your alarm early so that as well as catching sunset, you can catch sunrise the following morning, as if it's anything like the one that I witnessed, then you're in for a treat. Even after the sun was a decent way up in the sky, watching the fog gradually roll into the valley from that high up properly made it feel like you were in the heavens. So despite the staircase from hell at the beginning, it's all a very worthwhile experience. As we travel down the South Island, the next major traveller hotspot is Wānaka. This smallish town is mainly known for two things. Firstly, the Wānaka tree, which is arguably one of the most famous and picturesque trees in the world, and two, Roy's Peak. For this video, we're going to focus on Roy's Peak, although you should still definitely stop by the Wānaka tree whilst you're there, as it's much easier to get to. Roy's Peak is a 5-mile hike which covers over 4,000 feet of elevation, so it's by no means a leisurely stroll. The view from the main lookout point on Roy's Peak might be the most iconic shot in all of New Zealand, and it was a shot I was desperate to get myself under the perfect lighting conditions, so I decided to hike up for sunrise, which meant walking up in the pitch black for about an hour and a half. Even at 7 AM, I found that you had to queue and wait your turn to walk out to the iconic point, but in my opinion, if you want to get the best shot possible, then you'll want to climb up the steepish bank just behind the main viewpoints so that you get some elevation on everyone else. Then if you were a loner like me, then just sit and wait until your subject walks out and snap away. Big shout out to the random woman I captured in this shot. I always find it weird to think that she has no idea this photo exists, but her perfect pose helped to make it one of my favourite photos of the entire trip. Last up, and by no means least, is Milford Sound. Now, due to how crazy the landscape is in this part of New Zealand, it's not the easiest place to get to. As the crow flies, Milford Sound is only 88 kilometres from Queenstown, but you'll need to travel more than 3 times this to actually get there by road. I hopped on a coach that took me to a town called Tianu, which is situated at about the halfway mark between Queenstown and the Sound. Again, because of the landscape, there's only one road into the Sound, and from what I heard, it's not uncommon for it to be closed due to torrential rain or flooding. I was lucky in that the week I was looking to go was the first week in a couple of months that the road was open, which is quite crazy to think. I booked a tour which picked me up in Tianu the following day at 7 AM, and in the same way that the drive to Mount Cook Village was unbelievably epic, you definitely get the same feeling here, which was helped by the gigantic windows that were on the coach I was on. Once we arrived, it was a quick turnaround before we hopped on board our ferry and set out into the fjord. To put it simply, there are few places I've ever seen anywhere in the world that amazed me as much as Milford Sound did, and definitely no place has ever made me feel as small. When you're there, the perspective of things is hard to process, as you'll see a waterfall from really far away and think, oh wow, that looks pretty big, and then the closer you get, once you're directly below it, you're like, As you can see, I happened to go on a clear day, and given the early start, the sun was still coming up, which created for some of the most dramatic lighting I've ever seen. And whilst I'm definitely not complaining, I would love to go back there one day and see it on a rainy day, as I've seen some amazing footage of all the temporary waterfalls the rain creates, which adds an extra layer of beauty to what is an already epic landscape. And with that said, we have come to the end of my list. Now, some closing thoughts to wrap up the video. Which island did I prefer? It's very hard for me to say, as I took fairly different approaches to both islands. I'd definitely say I had more fun on the North Island, but that's largely down to the company that I had thanks to the Stray experience. I will say that you shouldn't sleep on the North Island in terms of what it has to offer. I'd heard a lot more hype for the South Island before I headed out to New Zealand, so I'd say the North Island definitely surprised me more, and the South Island 100% lived up to my expectations, which were about as high as they could have been. Is the Stray experience worth doing? Absolutely. I found it was a great way to meet other travellers, some of whom I'm still in contact with today, and some of the excursions I went on in the North Island definitely wouldn't have been as fun if I'd done them solo. I can't comment too much on whether Stray is better or worse than the other coach network that's on offer, which is called the Kiwi Experience, but from what I saw and heard whilst out there, I think that Stray overall has a slightly older age demographic, which suited me as I was 26 at the time, and the Kiwi Experience looked to be made up mostly of 18 to 21-year-olds. There's definitely less partying with Stray, which isn't to say that we didn't have some big nights, but there was rarely an instance where I was waking up massively hungover. Now, as for the South Island, the only thing that's really left me to say is what I thought about the juicy van I rented, which for reference was the cabana or crib model depending on the country that you're in. It was fine. My main pain points were that there wasn't a way of charging things like my camera, laptop and drone, and that you also had to reconfigure the back of the van each night in order to set up your bed. So maybe that sounds like I'm being picky, but the van I rented to travel the US the year prior was much more practical in both of these areas, and just an all-round better and more comfortable experience. But it also costs a lot more, so I guess it comes down to what your budget is. Which brings me on to the cost breakdown for those who are interested. I spent about £779 on Stray, £300 of which is essentially the cost to use their hop-on, hop-off bus service, which for me granted me access to the whole of the North Island. The remaining £479 went towards any activities I booked through their app and accommodation, as it's your responsibility to sort this out prior to arriving anywhere, although the app would always give you 2 or 3 options to choose from. The Juicy van cost me £700 to rent, which I had for 10 days, and then I spent another £100 on fuel. It's a little hard to pull a total cost of my trip together when I'm nearly 4 years late doing this video, but I believe I spent a little over £1,000 on everything else, be it food, drinks, campground fees, tours, and so on. So this puts my total month-long trip in New Zealand at roughly £2,600, and it was worth every penny. Putting this video together nearly 4 years after the trip has added an element of nostalgia that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise, although I definitely haven't needed reminding of how incredible this place is, as rarely does a week go by where I don't think about it in some way, shape or form. It was a month I will never forget, and one of, if not the best country I have ever travelled to. I can't wait to go back whenever that is, as there are plenty of sights and experiences I wasn't able to get to my first time around. So if you're watching this and have some suggestions, then please leave them in the comments below, or if you have any questions about my trip, then let me know and I will try and get back to you. I've missed posting about my trips on YouTube, so I'm going to try and be a little more active than I have been over the past 3 years or so. But for now, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Thank you.